So whenever, okay. All right, so good afternoon, or good morning, everyone. It feels like afternoon because we've been in sessions all morning, but what a wonderful conference we have been having for the last couple of days. And now the enjoyment continues, which is exciting. So first I want to give a shout out to my student from the University of San Francisco, my graduate student, Gavi, who's with us. So Gavi, nice to have you in this session. And I want to thank now because she's giving me the correct pronunciation. I will mess up her name and say I think it's Ava. Was it Eva? I'm sorry, Ava.
It's
Eva.
okay. It's Eva.
Eva. Oh wow. Okay,
Yes.
that's awesome. All right, folks. So we have here with us Dr. G.L.A. Harris. Those of us in the loop call her Gigi, but for purposes of this panel, we will be professional and say Dr. Harris, who's someone I have known for the last 20 years, and it has been such a great pleasure to see this young lady develop and grow in her career, and is doing some amazing things. I'm going to now just give you a brief bio, and it's just a snapshot of Dr. Harris and her background, who currently serves as the Senior Associate Dean at the Thunderbird School at Arizona State University. Dr. Harris is an accomplished scholar and consummate academic. G.L. Harris serves as the senior, as I just mentioned, the Senior Associate Dean and Professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And after 17 years of being a professor at Portland State University, prior to that, she was in the private sector. She is renowned for her research on the US military and forces in international militaries, especially those in NATO, and twice served as a Fulbright Distinguished Chair, which I'm so proud of her for. First as a research chair in North American integration to Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and most recently as NATO chair in security studies, a triplet venture between the Fulbright Commission, in Luxembourg and the University of Brussels. This was all a NATO affiliation. It was Harris's seminal research on student veterans that not only resulted in both state and federal legislation, but became the impetus and prototype for today's national movement for Veterans Resource Center on university and college campuses throughout the United States and around the world. Her research, we'll just talk about her research for just a second. Her research has been immense, and she has crafted over the last years of her career articles and books that are utilized throughout the country and beyond. Specifically, Dr. Harris writes on military affairs matters and is very engaged in that space. I always credit Dr. Harris as someone who has really made the military accessible to those of us who are not military folks. She has given us an appreciation for the military. And I will tell you, and Dr. Harris will be shocked when I say this, as a son of a veteran and a Marines man, I can tell you that I did not have much appreciation for the military until meeting Dr. Harris 20 years ago. And for that, I will forever be grateful. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure and my great honor to introduce someone I consider a friend, a confidant, a colleague, a mentor, and a sister, Dr. G.L.A. Harris.
Thank you, Dr. Richard Gregory Johnson III. Thank you so much.
It's my
a
great
pleasure, especially to have you moderate this panel. I'm very privileged to have you.
Thank you.
That said, my presentation is entitled Women in the Military and NATO, an Evolving Force. I actually made this original presentation in April the 5th to be exact, of 2018 to NATO, right before NATO moved to its current location, right across the highway in Brussels in Belgium. So I just want to give you a quick snapshot of what NATO is all about and how does it involve women in the military. So let's first start with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which I have a snippet of the background. I won't go through every single thing there, but it kind of shows you the beginning and from 1949 through now. And then the focus is actually the disproportionate impact of conflicts and war on women and girls. Women's need to play a more crucial role at every level of the decision-making process in conflicts at the local, regional, national, and international levels. And the UNCR, as it's called, 1325, there are 4 parts to it. First is participation, women's participation, the protection of women, the prevention of conflict that involves women, and also peace building. The reality on the ground is that the evidence shows that there's a direct correlation between the rates of conflict with violence against women. Gender equality has shown to sustain the prevention of conflicts. Women are therefore powerful players in building peace when they're included as participants in the decision-making process. Yet, women's inclusion, participation, and leadership are very much wanting. The gender-specific terms in peace agreements have declined precipitously. For instance, in 2016, to 50% as compared to those forged in 2014 at 70%. Gender disparities in humanitarian situations remain stark for women, with increasing mortality rates that are bleak for girls, and girls more than twice more likely to be out of school. The extreme groups also exploit gender and cultural norms for the purpose of recruitment that results in women and girls now constituting approximately 20 to 30% of foreign terrorist fighters. According to Claire Hutchinson was the 3rd Women, Peace and Security Ambassador for NATO in 2018. And she basically said the paternalistic obstacles have been the problem. So what is the role of security in NATO? So it shows you in 1998 to 2014 how it has evolved. And I also had the opportunity to interview the 2nd NATO ambassador, Mariette Sherman, in 2017. I actually took the train from Brussels, Belgium to the Netherlands to meet her. And she said, this is not only the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do, as mixed teams are smarter, meaning men and women, and perform better. We simply cannot leave any potential untapped. This was part of her farewell address when she was exiting the role as ambassador to NATO's Women, Peace and Security. However, it is important not to conflate peace and security. So what is NATO's role in security? The goals are full implementation by establishing objectives for partnerships, growing capabilities and interoperability, rendering support in changing and adapting member states and partner nations' militaries, such as through reform, increasing the opportunities for cooperation among member states and partner nations, to be accomplished through education, training, and exercises, combination of policies and programs, tools that help to determine all of the priorities, and building capabilities as well as capacities. There are currently 30 member nations of NATO. There are several partner nations that are divided into certain segments. So the Euro-Atlantic has about 20 partners. The Mediterranean has 7 partners. What is called the Gulf Cooperation Council has 4 partners. And the partners, other partners across the globe, there are about 9. So where are women represented in the military of NATO states? So there is an annual, what is called a gender perspectives report that is required of each member state to submit to NATO to basically reveal to what degree are women represented in their militaries. So at the time of a study that I conducted from 2017 to 2018, women comprised 10.9% of NATO's military, and also according to the report, represented an increase of 3.8% from 7.1% in 1999. And I will show you the rates from 1999 through 2013. Member states with the highest rates of women in the military at the time: Hungary at 20%, Slovenia, Latvia, the US, of course, and Greece. States with the largest in female workforce, who are the partner nations: Australia, Finland, and Austria. Where women represented in the military NATO states, it kind of shows you on the graph. Where women represented in the military in these NATO states, again, it shows you Hungary with the largest, and let's see, Turkey the least. Where women represented in the military of NATO states in the reserve, women represent 10% of the military's workforce in the reserve of these member states. What are the application and the recruitment rates for women in the military of NATO states? It shows you, for instance, Greece has the highest rate, followed by the US, the Czech Republic, Canada, France, and Japan. The recruitment levels in Greece are also the highest: the Czech Republic, Australia, Germany, the US, Canada, France, and Japan. What are the attrition and the retention patterns for women in the military of NATO states? The lowest attrition rates are in Turkey, obviously, because they have the smallest rates, our smallest number of women in the military. The lowest retention rate would be Slovenia, all the way to Sweden. The highest retention rates shows the Czech Republic and all the way to Australia. What are the policies employed to retain women in the military of NATO states? We're not talking about partner nations now, we're just talking about NATO states. Member states with their retention policies. 78% have retention policies specifically for women. 19% have retention rates that are not specifically targeted for women. If you note, interestingly enough, there is no such policy for women in the US military, which I find to be interesting. Why do women and men leave the military of NATO states? If you notice, the first at 33% for women and 37% for men, it talks about the problems in balancing work-family life. Next, leadership opportunities. Next, injury. Next, retirement. Next, lack of stability, and other, which could be a combination of things. What's interesting to note, though, even though men are more likely to be in the military than women, when you look at both pie charts, they seem to mimic each other, which is interesting. Where are women in the military employed? Women are more likely to be employed in this order: the Army, then the Air Force, Navy, and others. And if you look at figures 5A and 5B, again, even though the men are more likely to be employed in the military, where the women are employed, they seem to mimic the same patterns as the men. In what occupations are women likely to be employed in the military in NATO states? Under the guise of others, it would be 24.7%, medical 23.5%, logistics 13.7%, infantry, interestingly enough, 10.5%, but that represents a decline of 2% from 2015, and communication 6.5%. In what occupations are men more likely to be employed? Interestingly enough, in other, which is a broad category, 44%, infantry, 21.3%, logistics, 15.3%, communications, 6.3%, and in medical services, 3.8%. So our women, based upon the data that was produced in the most recent report on gender perspectives, are women more likely to be employed in military operations? From my analysis, it's uncertain. Why? The category other is broadly defined and is inclusive of such occupations as personnel serving in various ministries of defense, general staff, instructions in training units, engineers, technicians, general management, operational support, air traffic control and air support, military police, missiles and anti-air artillery, chemical corps, environmental units, land combat, naval combat athletes. The analysis basically does not represent a true reflection of where personnel are actually assigned or what their actual jobs or career fields are. The data need to be disaggregated to tell the true story of women's assignments. Occupational categories must be more narrowly defined to better gauge the utility and the operational placement of female personnel. So note, women's representation, as I said before, declined a whopping 2% in jobs that comprise infantry from 12.5% in 2015 to 10.5% in 2016. If anything, this decrease shows a marked regression in women's employment in combatants in those occupations, positions, and/or assignments that are designated as in the front line. So what does this mean for women's parity, growth, and representation in the disciplines that command the cachet for participation skill sets to be recognized to make them ultimately promotable through the ranks and/or for leadership in the military? So in 2014, 30% of member states employed some form that restricted women from certain roles in the military. 2015, that was reduced significantly to 15%. In 2016, that was reduced even further to 3.7%. So what is the status of force use in member states and partner nations recently? So in from late 2017 through 2018, I took a random sample of then 29 members, not 30, 29 members of the member states of NATO. And I decided to study 7 of them. So the characteristics are as follows. 6 were member states, 1 a partner nation, 2 studies represented the world's or represent the world's largest militaries. 2 are countries in Eastern Europe or part of the former Soviet bloc. 2 countries are in Scandinavia or the Nordic region. All of the countries have an army, navy, and air force. Most of the countries have reserve components such as home guards, which they may consider to be a 4th service that are called up as needed. Some state that it has become increasingly difficult, however, to recruit for the reserve. So such forces either comprise of older personnel and are only mobilized as needed, or the reserve component has been abandoned altogether. Such forces are primarily utilized for crisis management, for instance. The size of the military and the national priorities actually dictate the use of such forces. And some of the states I interviewed use contractual personnel to bolster their forces. So what is the status of women as a force in member states and partner nations whom I examined at that point? The enlistment criteria. So 4 of the states have voluntary enlistment, same age for men and women. The criteria, though, may be described as gender neutral, yet translate into different requirements, such as a physical fitness test in the coaches, which for whatever reason are different for men and women. Interestingly enough, the same applies in the US. The requirements may vary, though, in accordance with the service or the branch and the occupation. 3 of the states have compulsory or conscripted service. 1 state requires conscription of men only. The combat exclusion at the time, most states defined combat, though, in accordance with the units and or conditions in which personnel are placed, not the occupations of the personnel. All of the states interviewed or studied have no combat exclusion policy. All jobs are supposedly open to women. One state describes combat as a core business in lieu of using the term combat. One state, despite having no combat exclusion, still bars women from the nuclear submarine field, although a change was anticipated in 2020. So we'll see if a change did occur. One state defines combat occupations, positions, and assignments, in accordance with wartime needs. And one state admits to problems in putting occupations in categories as combat. So what is the status of women as a force in member states and partner nations recently examined? So the retention policies show that 6 states have such policies for both men and women. 4 states have specific policies targeted for women. 1 state has no such policies. 2 states have the policies for recruiting and retaining critical operations or occupations for women. 2 states have incentives for employers to hire civilian women in this case, in the reserve and guard. Some states say that they're simply overcommitted in overseas commitments. Further, many women would prefer to be homebound and close to their families. States use time-based rotation to spread the burden among the troops. 1 state deploys 10 to 15% of its female force to all operations. Now, interestingly enough, 5 states use what are called gender advisors. In fact, in some form of what is called gender focal point. I had the opportunity to work with a Lieutenant Colonel Magdalena Dvorakova at the time, who was assigned to NATO. 1 state uses no such function. 3 states use gender in operational exercises and or pre-deployment training. So 93% of member states include gender-specific training as part of pre-deployment or exercises. 77.8% include gender considerations in operational planning. 74.4% have trained gender advisors. 42.3% have gender focal points. 80.8% include gender as part of education and training. Interestingly enough, the number of gender advisors for the US military, which still is the largest military in the world, has only 2 gender advisors, which is kind of interesting. Okay, if you look at this graph, go all the way to the middle, you see USA and you see only 2 gender advisors for the largest military in the world. So where are women in the military? Where are they? Where are they in terms of rank? So the enlisted corps, you'll see women are a very small portion, and the commissioned corps the same in comparison to men. Where are women? Again, when you look at, interestingly enough, again, despite the proportion or the disproportion, I should say, when you do a pie chart, they seem to mimic each other, which is kind of interesting. So how do member states mitigate the prevalence of sexually related offenses among their personnel? 81.5% conduct specific training. 70.4% have instituted procedures to report such offenses. 69.2% employ specific personnel responsible for or by whom such incidents are handled. 70.4% have installed strategies to prevent the reoccurrence. 40.7% admit to the occurrence of such incidents, and 92% of sexually related offenses occur against women, whereas 8% occur against men. So how do the recently, meaning between 2017 through 2018 at the time, examine member states and partner nations manage incidents of sexually related offenses? So according to 1 state, has neither strategies, programs, training, nor reports for such cases. 1 state, which is the same state, has no gender education training program. 1 state has no specific strategies or an individual, which would be called a person in charge or person of charge to report these offenses. 4 states have specific strategies to address these problems. 1 state in particular has multiple gender training. Of the 5 states with gender advisors and or gender focal points, 3 deployed either or both to operational theaters. 3 states have not taken action to implement the recommendations that were made by NATO in 2015 and 2016. 2 Scandinavian states have been the most proactive in implementing such strategies. 1 state with multiple levels of gender training has also implemented these strategies. So what's missing? As far as I'm concerned, given the data, there has been an uneven reporting of information by member states and partner nations. So the fact that NATO requires this annual reporting of information showing to what degree women have been integrated into the various militaries of these member states, as well as the combat roles in which they serve, is this simply an annual exercise? Are countries in practice committed to changing the trajectory of fully integrating women into the military, or are there established policies for such integration simply a political condition of NATO membership? Is there selective reporting of data? How credible is information being provided? How are certain terms and reported data being operationalized from country to country? Occupations, positions, and or assignments designated as others is too broad a category to derive any utility from the data provided in terms of where women in the military are being employed or where they serve. How is the role of gender advisors being operationalized? Who or what is a gender focal point? How does each country define combat or occupations designated as combat? What is the rate of deployment for women and where are they being deployed? How does NATO ensure that member states and partner nations are complying with its programs, policies, and training? What are the mechanisms to verify the accuracy of the data that each member state and partner nation submits for inclusion into NATO's annual the reports on gender? Are there implications for any member state or partner nation's failure to implement any or all of the recommendations by NATO? So I recommend, I have several things that NATO's militaries and NATO itself should do. While military forces will vary from country to country, for instance, gender advisors, the term should be operationalized to ensure that they're operating with the same meaning or the same baseline. Limit the degree to which countries designate other as a default for occupations by encouraging the disaggregation of these data. Appoint an in-kind NATO special representative for women, peace, and security counterpart in the military, not civilian. An incumbent should have the authority of a general or a flag officer rank. That means individuals with stars on their shoulders. This would provide greater accountability to ensure the integrity of the data being provided by member states and partner nations. Deploy accreditation or audit teams to member states and partner nations as points to verify the data provided as a condition of continuing membership in and support of NATO. No state should audit itself. Establish explicit consequences for non-compliance to implement the recommendations. Increase resources in the way of staffing to NATO's Gender Advisor Office. Proactively explore to wrestle and confront such emerging and contemporary hotbed issues in the military, particularly for deployment in conflict and war zones, such as sexual orientation and transgender status of troops. So, women's integration into combat across NATO. So let's just kind of look at really what has happened. So Norway in 1985, they were the first to integrate women into operational and combat roles. Netherlands in 1988 started doing that. In Denmark in 2011, they started doing that. Canada began relaxing its the restrictions in 1987, and in 1989 through the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Interestingly enough, had an opportunity when I served in Canada. I studied the Canadian Armed Forces, women in the Canadian Armed Forces, and discovered that while the US simultaneously was denying its own female workforce from pursuing certain jobs in combat under its own combat exclusion policy, it was training other NATO countries in combat jobs. Spain, 1999, they made women eligible for combat. France in 2000, Germany and New Zealand in 2001, Romania 2009, and Australia 2013. And there's still exclusions. Turkey and Ukraine, women are still excluded from submarine special operations, armor, mine clearance. Israel, interestingly enough, you would think the most open of all of the countries. They're not a NATO country, they're a partner or a NATO member, but they're a partner nation, still reserves the right for women to be in certain jobs. Japan, interestingly enough, in 2017, opened some roles to women in combat. The Philippines in 2010, and even China, India, North Korea, Singapore, South Korea, and Sri Lanka have actually give partial access to ground combat roles for women. Here's the irony though, regrettably, myths still persist about women in combat based upon their ability to physically perform in the theater, unit cohesion, sexual harassment. Do they have the critical mass? And also, do they possess the leadership to do so? So NATO today expanding women, integration of women. So NATO assembled a research task force in 2020 to examine what member states and partner nations are actually doing to further integrate women into the military. So the US in 2013 announced that it would repeal the combat exclusion policy. Fortunately for us, the then Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, repealed it, period, in December 2015, and basically said, how can you deny half of your population from serving? In the UK, opened the last prohibited roles in July of 2016. Both, meaning the US and UK, are using a phased approach. The repeals were necessary for the following reasons, supposedly. Reflects each nation's democratic values. Access to combat represents equitable opportunities for women, provides access to senior leadership that rely on experience in combat operations, need to increase the capacity of mixed gender units. The US military's army has found that mixed gender units, meaning men and women, perform even better than single gendered units. Fully engage and educate women to contribute to effective performance, calls for the increased participation of women in combat roles and increased representation in senior leadership to fill operational demands. So 2016 and beyond, most NATO countries and partner nations have now removed combat restriction to women. The 15 NATO countries with the highest integration rates are Hungary, the US, Bulgaria, and so on. From 2017 on, women are most likely to basically serve in the same roles as they did before. So that category other is very misleading. In essence, while there has been, or where there have been representation of women serving in the respective militaries, since my 2018 study and in accordance with NATO's April 2021 technical report, despite the rhetoric and the annual required gender perspective reports, plus the expressed desire to expand women's representation of militaries of the respective NATO members and partner nations, have much change in terms of women's status in combat roles? I am not sure. So what can we learn from the Australian, from the Aussies? So what happened around 2012? The Australian Defence Force had basically a pandemic on its hands in terms of sexually related offenses, whether from sexual harassment to sexual assault. And basically then the chief of the army, Lieutenant General Dave Morrison, basically commanded an edict that said, if you are abusing your sisters, you need to get out of the services. And what the Australian case study or experience has really found is that without strong leadership, there's no reform. Diversity in leadership is an asset. It increases the capability of your force. It also increases the opportunities to drive more diversity. Retaining women by addressing premature attrition. Gender-based harassment and violence ruins lives, divides teams, and damages operational effectiveness. A military that is both accountable and transparent leads to a military that is strong and confident. With strong and committed leadership to change, the Australian Defence Force model can be employed, for instance, as lessons learned towards achieving the increasing integration of women into all facets of the military and organizational life. More recently, according to NATO's commander of Joint Force in Naples, Admiral James Foggo, he said, peace is more likely to prevail when women are empowered and intrinsically engaged in its creation. So for my study, I gave special thanks to these individuals at NATO and Fulbright, Belgium, and Luxembourg, as well as the American University, as well as the two ambassadors, one from Canada and former Ambassador Sherman of the Netherlands. And of course, the military and the deputy military reps of the 7 countries I studied. And there I am at NATO. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, for that insightful presentation. As always, I'm not surprised by the level of intellectual rigor that you've provided with us, and as well as a sort of practical perspective. And I'm thinking of the term that comes to mind, this sort of view from the top, but also from the bottom. You've just provided a great much for us to think about, particularly regarding your recommendations. And now we have about just 20 minutes or so for questions, and I'm going to first I want to make sure that I acknowledge my students, some of whom you've met before, Dr. Harris. Last fall, I see Jazz is in the house, who's awesome and will be graduating with her master's soon. Hey, Jazz.
Hi.
She's probably nervous that I put a shout out. And again, Gabi's here, and I don't see any more of my students, but if they are here, they can let me know. So Dr. Harris, I'm going to, and of course, greetings to all attendees here as well. Dr. Harris, I'm going to start with the first question, if I may, and if the audience members could have their questions prepared. It's a small group, so you don't need to raise your hand, you can just jump in. But Dr. Harris, my question for you specifically is around the sustainability aspect of attracting women to the military and ensuring up the support that they would need in order to thrive, not just to be there, but to thrive in the military. So how do we, and not just U.S., right? Because I think one of the things that I loved about your presentation is certainly that it was international in scope, and that's one of the things that we're discussing in my summer nonprofit class on sustainability is sort of looking at an international scope of things. So what do you think about this notion of sustainability, specifically when it comes to attracting and retaining women in the military? Because we all know that both of those equations are so important, right? Both pieces of that paradigm are so important. So what say you, please?
It's kind of like diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. It's not a fad that should be just, we use
Yes.
once in a while or, whenever it's popular, what have you. Women represent, at least in this country, for instance, at least 51.9% of the civilian population. And these NATO countries, for the most part, are democratic, and even the partner nations, and the fact that they have, because of membership, the condition of membership, they have agreed to not just integrate women into the military, but also integrate women in a way that women are weaved into the framework of each military. When you subordinate any group and women themselves are a minority as it is, but when you then further marginalize them by segregating them and putting them into only certain jobs, i.e. those support jobs, then basically you are conveying a message to women that you're not good enough. And as a result, when it's time to promote, there aren't enough women in the pipeline to promote. In fact, women will then prematurely attrit because they get, whether it's explicit or implicit, they will get the message that they're not wanted. And particularly when you've got, pandemic like sexually related offenses, women will get the impression that you don't want them. And particularly in a robust economy in any country, women will leave.
Okay, very good. I think that's spot on. And certainly I have some more follow-up questions, but I do want to open it up for our attendees who may have a question or comment. So, folks, are there questions or comments from the audience?
I have a question and comment.
Yes, Jazz. Hey, Jazz, how did I guess? I was counting on you to do a question.
Okay, good. Hopefully this gives me extra credit.
Absolutely. Excellent. That's right. Dr. Harris, you may remember Jazz Thomas.
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Sorry, I don't have my camera on today or yesterday. I have PCOS, and so sometimes I just don't feel good. But I definitely wanted to be present for your presentations, and I really appreciate your presentation. So this kind of combines a question and a comment. I am a veteran, and one of my current passions is promoting awareness regarding how skills, experiences, and education that service members and veterans obtain from the military are transferable to civilian positions. And a little perspective on that, I served in the Army National Guard, so most guardsmen have civilian employment. And a lot of my civilian employers looked at my military service as something that kind of took away from my civilian position, and they didn't really understand the skills that I was gaining. Additionally, as a veteran, when I would interview for jobs, a lot of people were very impressed by my military experience, but didn't see how those skills translated to the skills that I needed for that particular position. And so one of my passions, and this may be a capstone idea, Professor, is to really promote more awareness around how those skills are transferable to the civilian sector. And hearing your presentation, I think it ties into, first of all, what the topic I'm talking about applies to both men and women in the military, but to tie in to women in the military, I think I've heard this so many times where people think, civilians talk about how the government can do so much better for veterans. And I definitely agree with that statement, but there's so much better that civilians can do for veterans as well, and service members. And that ties into really understanding those transferable skills, and understanding those skills and experiences are very valuable to their sector, and to translate that to women. So many women are so career strong and career driven that if they know their skills and experiences are going to translate to the civilian sector, I think that gives so much more to the retention and attracting of women in the military. And I guess to translate that into a question, how do you think we can promote that awareness on understanding how those skills translate to the civilian sector, to human resources personnel or hiring managers and hiring officials?
So one thing, as you well know, that the military does a tremendous job at is leadership. Whether you're enlisted at whatever level or you're commissioned, you're always going either, whether it's through experience on the job training and or in professional development or in school. So the military does a very good job, regardless of your occupation, regardless of your MOS, regardless of your Air Force specialty code. You're able to transfer those leadership skills, not necessarily the technical skills, but certainly the leadership skills. I think another bar that particularly women, and quite frankly, women of color, and specifically Black women, also have to overcome is the fact that still today, women are not seen as individuals who should be in the military, because it's still not seen that women should be in the military. Now, if you're in a position, if you're in a job like as a nurse, possibly as a physician, maybe. But still, the idea that a woman is in the military, when people think of military, they automatically think of combat, which is fine. But that is part of the barrier. So it's your responsibility, the onus, Ms. Thomas, is on you to craft your resume in such a way that you laid out there as to how you translate those skills that you have gained in the National Guard and how you believe you can benefit any employer. Don't wait for them to do it for you. You do it. And then from that, the discussion will then help them to see how the skills, whether you were in infantry, whether you're in communications, whether you're in armor, in artillery, whatever you're in, the fact that you are first a leader. One thing I like with the Marines, particularly in the US, you're first a Marine. Whether you're male, female, being a cook or whatever, you're first a Marine. And that really speaks to the leadership skills. So what I'm asking you to do when you go back, to craft your resume in such a way that it delineates to any employer what your leadership skills are. Be results oriented, be performance oriented, how you changed what did you do, what did you change, what resulted as a result of your involvement. And I really think if they see you first and foremost as a leader, that will change. And I tell you why this is important. I had the opportunity with the Canadian Armed Forces to interview Sharon Perron. Sharon Perron was the first woman in the Canadian Armed Forces, regardless of the service, to successfully overcome. She was the first person to go in kind of like an Army Ranger training, Army artillery training. She was the first one to really make it. What they don't tell you is, why was she the first one? She was the first one because women never went through that before. Women were never accultured to go through that training. What they don't tell you is how many men have failed in those types of training. What's interesting, what I loved about Major Perron is that she was able successfully, she served in several leadership positions in Canada in corporate. She was successfully able to translate what she did in the military, and the fact that she led several forces to, whether it's Afghanistan, wherever, she was able to do that successfully, and they really appreciated that. But more importantly, she, not they, her prospective employers, she was able to define before her prospective employees, she defined what her leadership skills were and how she could contribute to what they did. So you define as opposed to having them define for you. Of course, based upon the opportunities that they have available, you again craft a way to find ways that you can showcase your leadership skills and how you can benefit that organization. And by having you, that is the way for them to achieve that. Does that help?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I definitely giggled a little bit, especially talking about how some people look at, you know, women's service in the military and just experiences in the military in general. I know when I was in and had civilian employment and I would have my drills on the weekend, I think the women that I worked with thought I was like marching around on a field, like I was in marching band or something.
It's ignorant.
And yeah, and so they didn't understand why I had to take time off of work to be able to do that, because I think they thought I was like twirling a baton or something. I don't know. When I was really out in the field and, like you said, leading missions and leading training, and gaining that leadership experience. But thank you for your words. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And what I would recommend, that's if you will take the time to educate them, because it's not that they're trying to be flippant. They don't know, and they don't know what they don't know. And as you know, Dr. Johnson said, if even despite the fact that his own father was a Marine, the impression that he got was not that positive of the military. And as a result, just through association with me, that's how he was really able to learn about the military. Because yes, the military has its problems, and as I showed in this in these data, the militaries all over the world have problems, particularly with women. But the point is, it's how you frame it, and the fact that you take the time to educate others. And I think when women educate others, I think it will at least help them, even if they still don't believe them, it will help them to be less narrowly focused and help them to understand. I hope that was helpful.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jazz. Hey, Dr. Harris, that was such a great response, but here's something a little bit off. It goes along with what you were just saying, but so, you know, my father was always saying whatever, right? But, you know, he always told my brother and I while we were growing up, we were just much too lazy to be in the military, so don't even try it. But he also added on to me, and you have asthma, so you could never serve. Now, that was always in the back of my head anyway, you know, but is that true? Like if you
Yes,
have
that is
asthma or some
true.
other
There
condition?
are certain, well, number one, it depends, the military, and it depends upon timing. So the military will tighten and loosen its recruitment depending upon the needs, also depending upon the economy. The more robust the civilian economy, the more difficulty that the military has in recruiting for whatever. It also depends, it has a lot to do with the occupation for which they're trying to recruit. So if they're trying to recruit for nuclear, whatever, they need certain individuals. For instance, the only reason why, interestingly enough, the US Navy decided to bring women in as submariners is not necessarily because they wanted women. It was really for selfless reasons, was because men no longer in the Naval Academy aspire to those roles, one, and as a result, two, men no longer were pursuing those degrees, but it was women who was now pursuing those degrees. So it was kind of like a perfect storm. They took advantage of the women, the critical mass of the women who now wanted to be in more technical degrees, because women also recognize that for them to advance in the military, it was important for them to pursue these more technical fields. Military police was at one time the only non-combat roles under the combat exclusion policy that women could pursue to become a flag officer. Now women can go into, artillery, armor, combat support, what have you, to achieve those ranks. And if you notice, only men were the flag officers or the generals. I had the opportunity, fortunately, to actually, I know of now three female 3-star generals who have actually, I mean, and in the Marines, that's just in the Marines.
Mhm.
So
That's
they're getting there. They're not getting there fast enough, but they're getting there. But they realize also that if they don't get there, that when it comes time for recruitment, they won't be able to recruit because there's no pool from which to recruit. So
So,
they
so
have
in
to
other
be
words,
proactive.
I could have had a shot.
You could have. So it depends upon, it depends upon the career field, and it depends upon the timing.
Well, again, I think after my father made the declaration to my brother and I that he honestly thought we were just much too lazy and we would never make it in the military. And so after that, we were like, okay, yeah,
But that's okay. You seem
that
to have
sounds
done extremely well.
so,
And I'm sure if you were in the military, you would have done just as well. So it just depends.
it just depends. Wow, that's amazing. So we have just 5 minutes left. Are there any other questions from the audience, please? Oh, folks are silent. They're overwhelmed by the presentation, Dr. Harris, which was really, again, so insightful. But, I wonder if you would just spend a couple of minutes talking about the Disclusionary Act from yesterday's panel. I think that was, like I said, I was embarrassed because I was not aware of it. So, if maybe you could just talk to us a little bit about that and what that means.
Well, the combat exclusion policy, whether it's in the United States military or whether it's in another military, basically bars women from pursuing certain what is still deemed to be combatant or ground combat jobs or close ground combat. Right now, the US military, the United Kingdom, Canada, they have employed a phased approach to get women into these jobs. But as I said earlier, what's interesting is even though as early as 1987, when the US military was denying its own female workforce from pursuing these very jobs, i.e. fighter pilots and the like, they were training the Canadian Armed Forces and other female forces in NATO countries to pursue these very jobs. So the level of hypocrisy. So we say one thing, but here's the irony. Wars also dictate. It really was the commanders, at least for the US military, that really were the facilitators that convinced the military, notwithstanding the performance of women in the theater, that it's time to repeal the combat exclusion policy. It made no sense. So it was the commanders on the ground because they realized that, a person is a person is a person. If the person is trained in that area, then utilize that person. I'll just say this one story. One of the individuals I had interviewed for one of my books, she was the first female to command a ship. Lieutenant, I can't remember, Darlene Askra. And Darlene said that in around, I think it was 1986, they were about to approach an area. Oh,
excuse me, Dr. Harris.
Okay, I'll continue my story. Please attend our